Today we have some extraordinary news to share with you about one of Philadelphia's oldest unsolved homicides. In February of 1957, the body of an unidentified child was discovered inside of a box in a wooded area near Susquehanna Road in Northeast Philadelphia. The boy appeared to be malnourished, and his body bore the signs of recent and past trauma. In his very short life, it was apparent that this child experienced horrors that no one should ever be subjected to.
Most children are missed the very second they vanish. But when 4-year-old Joseph Zarelli was beaten to death, his killers didn't panic. They didn't run. They sat him down, neatly clipped his fingernails, washed the blood from his skin, and crudely shaved his head to make him unrecognizable. Then, they packed him into a cardboard box like a piece of unwanted trash and left him in the freezing Pennsylvania woods. For 65 years, detectives searched the globe for a frantic mother looking for her lost boy. They never found her because she wasn't looking. This isn't a story about a boy who went missing. This is a story about a family that erased a child from existence and the strangers, decades apart, who refused to let him stay that way. Welcome to Mysterious Crime Chronicles, where the cases everyone forgot get remembered. If this story already has your stomach in knots, imagine living it for 65 years. Hit subscribe before we go any further, because this one only gets heavier from here.
Without the hard work, dedication, and passion and the doggedness of the many, we would not be here today to give America's formerly unknown child, Joseph Augustus Zarelli, a voice.
On February 26, 1957, at 10:40 a.m., the remains of a white male, estimated to be 4 to 6 years of age, were located in a wooded area with dense underbrush.
Late February 1957. A college student is driving down Susquehanna Road, a lonely, wooded stretch on the edge of Northeast Philadelphia, when a rabbit darts across his path. He pulls over, chases it into the underbrush, the way anyone might on a slow afternoon with nowhere else to be. That's when he sees the box. A cardboard bassinet box, the kind JCPenney used to ship baby furniture in, half hidden in the weeds, and inside it, staring up at him, a small face. For one merciful second, his brain does what brains do to protect us from things we aren't ready to see. He tells himself it's a mannequin, a discarded store display, dumped illegally along with the trash, because the child's head had been shaved, crudely, unevenly, clearly after death, and his tiny body was so wasted by starvation that skin barely covered bone. Nothing about him looked alive. Nothing about him looked human enough to be real. Then it does. And what this stranger does next is the detail almost nobody talks about when they tell this story. He doesn't call the police. He doesn't flag down a passing car. He gets back in his vehicle and he drives away, carrying the worst secret of his life alone for 2 full days before he finally picks up a phone. 2 days. A dead child lying exposed on the side of a road in the freezing Pennsylvania cold, and the only living person who knew he was there said nothing. Not out of cruelty, out of pure, paralyzing horror. But it means for 2 extra days, a 4-year-old boy who had already been erased once by whoever killed him was erased a second time by the silence of a man too traumatized to speak. When police finally arrived on February 25, 1957, what they found told them almost everything, and almost nothing at all. Here's where this case gets genuinely disturbing, not because of what happened to Joseph, but because of what his own body proved about the people who killed him. He hadn't been thrown away in a panic. He'd been prepared. His fingernails had been neatly trimmed. His body had been washed clean of blood. His hair, cropped off after death, clumps of it still clinging to his skin when he was found. Evidence that whoever did this hadn't even let him keep the one identifying feature that might get him recognized. He was wrapped gently in a soft, multicolored blanket before being placed inside that box, like a mother tucking in a child for the night, and then left in the woods like garbage. Sit with that contradiction for a second. Someone folded a blanket around this child with care, and someone shaved his head to make sure no one would ever know who he was. Those two acts came from the same hands. The autopsy revealed more. Severe, chronic malnutrition. The kind that doesn't happen overnight. The kind that happens over months of someone choosing, again and again, not to feed him. Old scars layered over new bruises, and surgical scars on his ankle, his groin, under his chin, proof that at some point in his short life, someone had taken him to a doctor. Someone had gotten him medical care. And then, somewhere between that hospital visit and this ditch on Susquehanna Road, someone had decided his life didn't matter enough to keep. The description investigators circulated was almost unbearably specific, and that's exactly what made the silence that followed so disturbing. He was roughly 3.5 feet tall, about 30 pounds, dangerously underweight for a boy investigators estimated to be somewhere between 4 and 6 years old. He had a distinctive lazy left eye, the kind of detail a parent, a sibling, a doctor would recognize instantly. A surgical scar on his chin, from what appeared to be an old injury that had been professionally treated. This wasn't a child who'd simply slipped through the cracks of an indifferent world. This was a child someone had taken to a doctor at least once, had looked in the eye every single day, and had still made the choice to let him disappear. Police fingerprinted him immediately, certain, the way investigators always are at the start, that someone would come forward within days. A grandmother, a neighbor, a teacher, anyone. Nobody ever did. The Philadelphia Inquirer printed 400,000 flyers of his face and sent them out across the city, including 400,000 households, opening their mail, staring into the eyes of a dead child nobody could name. And still, silence. Because here's the detail that separates this case from almost every other cold case we've ever covered on this channel. No missing person report was ever filed for Joseph. Not by a parent, not by a relative, not by anyone. He had no social security number, no school enrollment on record. As far as any official document in the United States was concerned, this little boy had never existed at all until the day he was found dead in a box. Somebody made sure of that, and for the next 65 years, it worked. With no fingerprints on file and no missing person report to match him against, investigators did the only thing they could. They tried to give this boy a face the public could recognize, even in death. A forensic artist sketched his likeness from photographs taken at the scene, and that sketch became the image printed on those 400,000 flyers. Detectives went further than almost any other case of its era. They had a local funeral home prepare his body and dress him, then photographed him lying as if peacefully asleep, hoping a softened, more lifelike image might jog a memory that a crime scene photo never could. Over the following decades, as forensic science advanced, his image was updated again and again. New composite sketches, a clay facial reconstruction built directly onto a cast of his skull, each version an attempt to close the same impossible gap. How does an entire city fail to recognize a face for 65 straight years? And here's the detail that turns this from a case file into something almost unbearably human. For decades, one homicide detective, long after he'd retired, long after the case had been reassigned again, and gone cold more times than anyone could count, drove out to Joseph's grave every single year on the anniversary of his discovery. Alone. No cameras, no press release. Just a man standing over a headstone that, for most of those years, still read only America's Unknown Child, refusing to let this case become nothing more than a number in a filing cabinet. That's the part people forget about cold cases like this one. It's not just evidence sitting in a box somewhere. It's people, investigators, forensic artists, funeral directors, quietly refusing, year after year, to let a murdered child be forgotten, long after the world around them already had. If you're new to this channel, this is what we do. We take the cases everyone assumes are unsolvable, and we show you exactly how they finally cracked. Subscribe now, because the next part of this story is where 65 years of investigators nearly lost him for good, 3 separate times. If this story only had one villain, it would already be unbearable. It has 2, the people who took his life, and the decades of dead ends that let them get away with it. For 6.5 decades, Philadelphia detectives chased this case with a devotion that bordered on obsession, and it wore them down, one generation at a time. Retired cops, forensic scientists, a volunteer crime-solving group called the Vidocq Society, made up of retired investigators and profilers who took up the case in the 1990s because they simply could not let it go cold. Many of the men and women who spent their careers chasing this boy's name died without ever hearing it spoken out loud. And 3 times, the case came close to breaking wide open, and 3 times, it slipped away. The first time, in 1998, investigators zeroed in on a foster family that had once lived near the discovery site. It was a strong lead. Detectives sat down and interviewed the foster father and his stepdaughter directly, certain they were finally about to hear a confession. Instead, records confirmed every foster child in that household was accounted for. Dead end. The second time, in 2002, a woman known only as Martha walked into a police station with a claim that stopped everyone in the room cold, that her own parents had purchased a boy from his birth parents in 1954, beaten him to death, and dumped his body. For a moment, investigators believed they finally had their answer. But Martha had a documented history of mental illness, and neighbors who'd lived near the property during that exact period flatly denied any child had ever lived there. Another dead end. The third time should make you angry. In 2013, the case got its most promising lead yet, a DNA connection tracing to a family in Memphis, Tennessee. Investigators developed the lead alongside the Vidocq Society in early 2013, but it took them until January 2014 just to obtain a DNA sample from the family member in question. Then, nothing. Silence. The sample sat, while a family somewhere believed they might finally have answers about a case that had haunted an entire city for 6 decades. It wasn't until December 2017, 4 years after the lead first surfaced, that police finally confirmed the DNA didn't match. 4 years. To rule out one lead. There was a 4th attempt too. One most coverage of this case skips entirely. In 1998, the same year Joseph was quietly reburied with a real headstone. Investigators authorized an exhumation of his remains for more advanced forensic testing, a decision made specifically because the Vidocq Society had just taken on the case and believed 1990s-era DNA technology might finally succeed, where 1957 detective work couldn't. It didn't. The technology of the era still couldn't extract a usable profile from remains that old and that degraded. Another 2 decades would pass before science finally caught up to this case. Somewhere in all of that delay, the 4 lost years in Memphis, the failed 1998 exhumation, the false leads from a foster family and a woman named Martha, evidence could have degraded further. Memories could have faded. Witnesses could have died without ever being interviewed. This is exactly the kind of institutional slowness that turns a solvable case into an unsolvable one, and you'll see it again and again in the cold cases we cover on this channel. While detectives chased dead end after dead end, Joseph himself lay buried in a potter's field, the burial ground reserved for the unidentified and unclaimed. No headstone, no name, just a number in a ledger, the same as every other forgotten body a city didn't know what to do with. But somebody refused to let him stay that way. In 1998, more than 40 years after Joseph was found, the son of the very funeral director who had originally handled his burial back in 1957 stepped forward. He donated a coffin, a headstone, an entire funeral service, and Joseph was exhumed from that anonymous field and reburied at Ivy Hill Cemetery. given for the first time a dignified resting place, a plot of his own, care of a stranger with no blood relation to him whatsoever, simply because one family had decided, across 2 generations, that this boy deserved better than a number in a ledger. He still had no name, but for the first time in over 4 decades, he had a home. And people kept coming back to that home. Every year, members of the Vidocq Society and local volunteers gathered quietly at his graveside for a small memorial service. No cameras, no headlines, just people who had never met this child, standing over his grave year after year, refusing to let him become just another cold statistic in a city full of them. For over 20 years, that headstone read only America's Unknown Child, and every single year, someone still showed up anyway. In 2019, Joseph was exhumed one final time, not to move him again, but so investigators could extract fresh bone and tooth samples using extraction methods that simply didn't exist in 1957, or even in 1998 when the last attempt had failed. It was, by that point, his body's 3rd disturbance since being laid to rest, buried nameless in 1957, reburied with dignity in 1998, and now exhumed a 3rd time in the hope that 62-year-old Bone could finally tell investigators what an entire police department had failed to learn from the living. By 2019, 62 years after Joseph's death, his DNA had degraded to almost nothing. Forensic genealogist Colleen Fitzpatrick, who took on the case, later called it the hardest case of her entire career. She described what was left of his genetic material in one unforgettable phrase. It was like confetti, shredded into pieces so small and so damaged that ordinary DNA testing simply couldn't use it. Think of it like this. Imagine tearing a photograph into 1,000 pieces, burying half of them, and being asked to rebuild the picture anyway. That's what Fitzpatrick's team was working with. New forensic techniques let them examine far more of Joseph's genetic code than older methods ever could, piecing fragment after fragment together, as she described it, like solving a big Sudoku puzzle, until finally, the pieces lined up into something usable. That profile was uploaded to public genealogy databases, and it found a match. A second cousin, once removed, who had voluntarily submitted their own DNA years earlier with absolutely no idea it would one day help identify a murdered child. From there, detectives obtained a court order for the birth, death, and adoption records of every child born to the suspected mother between 1944 and 1956. Buried inside those records was a birth certificate, dated January 13, 1953, that would finally give this boy back his name. It also listed the name of his father, letting investigators confirm the connection from both sides of his family tree at the same time. December 8, 2022. Philadelphia Police Commissioner Danielle Outlaw stood at a podium in front of cameras from across the country and said words that had been 65 years in coming. For 65 years, the story of America's unknown child has haunted this community, the Philadelphia Police Department, our nation, and the world, she said. Despite the fact that Joseph Augustus Zarelli's entire identity and rightful claim to his own existence was taken away, he has never been forgotten. Beside her, William Fleischer of the Vidocq Society, the man who'd spent a quarter of a century fighting for this exact moment, could barely hold himself together. Many of these men and women aren't with us anymore, he said, but I feel their souls are standing here at this moment with us. Then, quietly, now our lad is no longer that boy in the box. He has a name. Joseph Augustus Zarelli, born January 13, 1953. Died February 1957 at 4 years old. He had living siblings on both sides of his family, siblings who, for their entire lives, had no idea a brother had ever existed, let alone that he'd been resting in a marked grave a few miles from where they'd grown up, waiting 65 years for someone to say his name. The announcement made front pages and led news broadcasts across the entire country, not just in Philadelphia. For over 6 decades, the boy in the box had been taught in criminology courses, referenced in forensic textbooks, and passed down through true crime circles as the case that might genuinely never be solved. When Joseph Augustus Zarelli's name finally broke, It wasn't just a local story closing out a local mystery. It was one of the oldest, most studied cold cases in American history, finally answering the one question it had refused to answer for 65 straight years. Who was he? Before any of this reached a podium or a headline, detectives made a point of reaching those surviving relatives privately first, sitting down with people who had no idea this conversation was coming, and telling them that a brother they never knew existed had been murdered as a small child, then hidden from the world for 65 years. Imagine being handed that news. Not a mystery solved. A grief you never knew you were allowed to have, delivered all at once, 6.5 decades late. Here's the part of this story that should stay with you long after this video ends. Joseph has a name now. He has a grave with his name carved into the stone. But the person, or people, who starved him, beat him, and packed him into that box like garbage have never been identified, never been arrested, never faced a single consequence in 69 years. Police say they have suspicions. They won't say who. It remains, to this day, an open homicide investigation, and there is currently a $20,000 reward for information that leads to an arrest. Somewhere out there, someone may still know exactly what happened inside that house on 61st and Market Street in the winter of 1957. Maybe more than one person knows, and for 69 years, they've said absolutely nothing. If you know this case, if you've ever heard a whisper, a family rumor, anything at all, Philadelphia police are still listening. The Philadelphia Police Department's Homicide Unit has confirmed this case remains open and active, not archived, not closed, not quietly shelved the way so many cases this old eventually are. Detectives assigned to it say they still receive tips, still follow up on them, still treat every new piece of information as though it might be the one that finally closes this out completely. Anyone with information is asked to contact Philadelphia Police directly or submit a tip anonymously through the department's tip line. And given everything you now know about how this case was finally cracked, it's worth remembering that the tip that broke it wide open didn't come from a detective at all. It came from an ordinary person who once submitted their own DNA to a genealogy website for something as simple as tracing their own family tree, with absolutely no idea it would one day help identify a murdered child. The next tip that matters might be just as ordinary. Because Joseph Augustus Zarelli finally got his name back, he's still waiting for his justice. If this one hit you the way it hit us putting it together, say his name in the comments. Joseph Augustus Zarelli. Let's make sure the algorithm knows this case still matters to people. Subscribe if you want more cases like this one, dug up and told right. This is Mysterious Crime Chronicles. We'll see you in the next one.